Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making the Rounds, also known as Fidget Spinner Edition. Phoenix One Fidget Spinners. Literally, they're just everywhere. I go to the venue, and I cannot stop. I refuse to touch them. Okay, so
There,
and I avoid people who have them,
I
usually very
already did
pointedly.
this
So,
at NALCS, where Riley, one of the camera people for Phoenix One, he's like just brought in this giant backpack of fidget spinners. It was so heavy. I was like, how are you carrying that around?
I really
He made so many.
I like the Phoenix One media manager guy a lot because you usually the press room experience is like everyone's backstage and you sit backstage and the Riot press person asks you who do you want after each game. You put in maybe your first choice, your second choice for each team, and then they come back and say, okay, we can give you this player, this player. The Phoenix One media guy, he is just dedicated, right? He comes back himself and he's
Hmm.
like, "Who do you want? What's this? Please message me on Twitter so that I can get the team to market the interview when it comes out, all the stuff." This guy
Yeah,
is
he's
good.
good.
So I really appreciate that. So I'm not going to be down on Phoenix One's marketing team, but dear God,
You're just sick of this
it's just
fidget.
I can't. So I'm hoping they leave when Phoenix One leaves. So theoretically, that's tomorrow. But God, you can't be that optimistic. You can't. They'll probably linger for at least a month or something. Anyway.
Which ties into related to Phoenix One, North American junglers.
Yes.
So obviously Spence Garen unfortunately is discounted from this because he's not actually North American. Um, However, we have two North American junglers. I think a lot of people have been talking up NA jungle talent since last year,
Hmm.
when Dardoch came up. And following that, so there was Dardoch, there was a Nori. Contracts was already on a lot of people's radars, but the fact that he was underage was a problem. So he was playing in Challenger, because he couldn't actually play for LCS teams. Um, and he had his debut last split. We had Acadian having his debut last split. And then most recently, Mike Young is someone who has been on the ladder for a while, and when he came in, a lot of people already knew of him from the ladder, and he has performed really well at this tournament. So a lot of people have been saying, like, any jungle talent is really, really strong. I've been like more weirdly like cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Hmm.
And I think it's because when I look at a lot of junglers from North America who come up off the ladder, and this includes Mike Young, and it kind of ties into something you were saying yesterday, where like some of the things he's getting away with, he shouldn't, so you're
Hmm.
afraid he's going to be taught bad habits because he
Yeah.
obviously has talent, but then it's like, no, like, don't invade there because it's going to be really bad for you at some point in the future, even if you're getting away with it now. Um, and I also think that we probably need a little bit more time for teams to figure out Mike Young. At this tournament specifically, we've already touched upon the how EU, or how European teams basically approach the game, and one of the weaknesses we pointed out was their jungle mid
Hmm.
synergy. So I think that's also something that's tying into it. I'm not trying to take away anything from Mike Young. I don't want people to think I
I
dislike
am.
him. Okay, well you are, but I'm not because I like the idea that NA has some of this raw talent coming off
Sure.
the ladder. The
And I
thing
don't
that
have anything
concerns
against that at all. I
Yeah,
just.
the thing that concerns me is I'm gonna use Dardoch as an example, and only because he said this in an interview with me, and it's already out when I was comparing the Xmithy Dardoch swap this split.
Sure.
And basically what he said is when he felt like he was kind of on his own for the first two splits where he thought he knew the game. And then
Mm.
he came to CLG where you have players, like Huhi, like Aframu. Like I know people love to shit on Huhi, but he is very smart about the game. And Aframu, everyone who's worked with him it always makes a point to say like how ridiculous his pattern recognition is and just how good he is at picking up on stuff, and then he always tries to communicate that to the team, and he's always watching VODs. And I know this is something they've done with Dardoch this split, and Dardoch has come out and said himself, like, I thought I knew the game. I totally didn't know the game.
Sure.
And so that's the thing, that's the only thing that concerns me when people really start hyping up these North American junglers, because like, for example, contracts, I think a few of the games we saw him going off on, it was on something like the Kazakhs, where he was really returning to what made him so successful in the spring, which is where he could kind of like farm and then pop off on more of a carry champion. And I'm I'm like really hesitant. I'm still very hesitant to say that any jungle talent is like ridiculously superior, because I think that with as it is with junglers in any region, like I see this in Korea too, where these mechanically gifted junglers will come up and then there'll be no one to teach them, and then they'll either struggle a lot until they find a team that can teach them macro stuff and
Sure.
communication with their lanes, or they just become like flawless. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add, but I guess like that's my hesitation when saying like, man, any jungle talent is stacked. It's like jungle, I feel like jungle of all positions really isn't like, I don't think any position should be raw mechanical talent, but specifically jungle, just because of the role itself. Like, you need to know so much about the game, and that
It's
takes time and experience.
it's come to my attention that I may overrate pathing understanding when I rate junglers a little bit. Just so I could do with rating raw mechanics a little bit more, or just not inting theoretically. But I think that for me the biggest thing to understand again is just how you use the fact that the lanes are pushing, or whether or not, because I think a lot of it is really really dependent on your lane. And if you're playing against a team, like if you're playing with a mid laner like Exile, for example, who's a very specific champion pool and very specific and very small understanding of lane matchups, you're going to be constantly losing. This is going to be losing your mid lane. This is going to affect the type of jungle champions you play in your pool. It's going to affect your ability to take duels in the enemy jungle, your ability to try to affect the game. You end up having to take more risks because you have to try to influence lanes that are losing when they shouldn't be losing, and you're already going up against a laner that's going to be ahead of your laner. So if the other jungle ends up in the mix, you could theoretically be in a losing 2v2. So I think that people don't really understand that aspect of jungling, and a lot of times when people are rating junglers, they're just like, oh, how much does he gank? And then there's that really annoying jungle proximity stat that people overrate, which I like to use it as something that just like talks about what part of the map the jungler kind of favors influencing and where the better synergy is, but I don't like to use it as whether or not a jungler is good, you know?
I see it as something like kill participation, actually, where I don't think
Yeah.
kill participation is an end-all be-all for a support or a jungler, actually, but it tells you more how the team works, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I think jungle proximity should be used.
Yeah, and you'll end up with things like Xerxes has insanely high kill participation. Yeah, but that's because all of their kills happen in the mid lane after 30
Mid
minutes.
5v5.
And the entire team has insanely high kill participation. So, yeah, I don't really understand some of the stats, and like, oh, this guy gets first blood all the time. Yeah, that's totally all that you should be doing as a jungler. But so for me, this is the frustrating thing. I think it's fair to say, however, that North America is playing to the jungler better, if that makes sense. So, and if you're playing to the jungler better, then you can utilize the talent that the jungler has more. So obviously that's going to help them develop better. That's and you'll be able to make the jungler look better. You'll be able to train better habits theoretically if you're playing around the jungler, which means don't
Yeah.
send them to Europe when they're young. It's very
I mean, another quick thing. I know I brought this up yesterday, but I think another thing that people are, again, I'm not trying to take away from Mike Young because I
Mhm.
think it says a lot about him and his character that he can go to an event like this and look really well and perform well with the team. You know, like the team, to your point, is playing around him very well. They're drafting for him very well. They're following up for him very well. All of that, like it's not like the team is making him look good. It's a give and take thing between both the player and the team. But I do think another thing that cannot be understated is the fact that Xpecial has also been having a really good tournament, and that has affected where they can put pressure on the map because once again they have a winning bot, and that's actually super important. So I think that is another reason why Mike Young has looked so good because he really doesn't have to worry about bot, and as we've seen him, he's usually up on the top side. So I
And
think that that also has like not maybe not a lot to do with it, but it's definitely a factor that I think people should be considering.
also, I think I mean, even Mike himself said that Xpecial is really important in comms and just the general state and mood of the team. So I think that's worth noting as well. I also think that, I mean, Ryu historically has been a mid laner that doesn't perform well if his side lanes are failing a lot. And it's just for him, it's really hard to feel motivation in these types of situations. So I think that that's something that people are underrating as well because you suddenly have a mid laner who is creating a bridge for your jungler much more on
Yep.
P1 than he was in the past. And again, we've brought up the mid laners and the sort of, I think actually UOL's drafting understanding is pretty good. It's just they use it for evil. Like the C9 UOL game today was actually really, really like C9 got outdrafted so hard that game. Uh, if you think about the matchups and just in general how the game is going to play out, because you end up with them, they blind LeBlanc into a team that plays Kassadin. So right away, like Kassadin, if he queues for trades, it's just really hard for LeBlanc to deal with that, even
Yeah.
uh, just super early into the game. Like after Cass's first back, like usually LeBlanc will push Cass in until he has to back under tower, and then he has to TP to lane. But after he TPs to lane, he'll usually have like Dorian Shield and Dark Seal, and maybe Corrupting Potion, and then he'll be able to do or refillable, and then he'll be able to trade pretty effectively in lane. And he's usually fine just after that bit, and that's when like Kassadin basically starts to win the lane. You end up
Yeah.
with a LeBlanc and you a Gnar, so you have theoretically two winning lanes, so that's a good scenario to be in. And then in the bot side, you have Twitch, Tom Kench, which is not a good lane against what C9 had, but UL's bot lane's pretty good at going even or barely losing. So, and then you have two winning lanes out anyway, so that's fine. And then they have the Tom Kench, so you all have this really disgusting mid-game teamfight comp, and you can't really side lane because Kassadin is like stupidly good at side laning, and also if you try to side lane, you're against Tom Kench Twitch, which is the most cancerous thing to try to side lane side lane against. So you're just like they got outdrafted in my opinion so hard, and I think that you will actually understand draft and these types of matchups well. It's just that Exile's champion pool is really small. They have a really bizarre understanding of what they think is good, and they try all these sorts of weird shit. But I actually think UOL's drafts are pretty smart when they're thinking about it concentrated, and they're really good at predicting what you're going to do in draft. So I really just think like the champion pools of the players kind of and their really specific style hold them back more than anything. So I mean, like, but you could see the difference in that game just in and of
Yeah.
itself. how very different the early game went just with a good draft. So I think that that's something to consider when we talk about NA junglers. Anyway, that was a really long rant that was
Woo.
tangentially related to what we were talking about when I was talking about you.
It makes sense. And now for the hot button issue that everyone's been. So today this kind of turned into a meme because
Sure.
Fnatic got their first dragons of the entire
Tournament.
tournament. So Kelsey, tell me what is up with European dragon control or remarkable lack thereof?
So I think the thing with dragons is that you're constantly Europe likes to talk a lot about what do you do with tempo advantage, right? They're constantly talking about what do you do with tempo advantage, and the major objectives are always going to be turrets. So Europe wants to take, if they have a tempo advantage, they want to take the turret. And this usually means that if they have a back advantage in bot, and maybe they're losing bot lane, because they play a lot of losing bot lane matchups. Like, I don't know if you noticed this over the course of the tournament, that they like to play like Twitch and stuff.
I'm pretty sure it's what I was tilting about on day one, yes.
But they'll if they end up in a situation where their top is winning and their bot is losing, they'll back and then they'll go top and they'll push this turret. They'll expose Drake. Enemy team either gets Drake or decide that they don't want Drake because Drake is not as good as a turret and trying to match top. Or I think this was exacerbated to an extent by Herald, because guess what Herald gives you? It gives you more turrets.
More turrets.
So they'll trade a lot of dragons that I guess other regions might not trade for Rift Heralds. So I think that this is
Yeah,
a
I mean,
big issue,
when we look at
especially... Oh, go ahead.
yeah. Oh no, I was just gonna say, so in comparison, I think one of the reasons why North America has been getting a lot more dragons is because typically when we look at North America, and this is something that you and I have both brought up on League Weekly before, but sometimes North American teams will just fight over Drake even when they shouldn't. So it's kind of a weird opposite thing where a lot of times when I look at teams in North America and Dragon and their relationship with Dragon, it's not even, I'm not going to say they over prioritize it because I think that's incorrect. I think it's just that teams need to realize when they can fight the other team. Like, they need to consider a little bit more like things like item advantages or levels or where the rest of the team is on the map, TP advantage, waves, all of those things that you should be paying attention to anyway when you're trying to set up vision and then also going in for dragon. And that's, I think, where they falter. And so you see a lot of really funky fights actually around dragon sometimes in North America where teams could trade it for something else. So I think Europe is the opposite of that, like to an extreme, which is it's a very interesting
interaction.
Yeah.
I think the weird thing though is that if NA are the more early focused, you would think that they'd prioritize the turrets much more, right? Because they want the early gold injection of the first turrets, and then if Europe are gonna play these like long drawn out games, then they should care more about dragon control, because things like mountains and infernals are gonna matter much more as the game goes on. And also oceans let them stay in lane longer. So it's just really bizarre to me that it's this way, and I think that's a problem for both regions.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm just hilarious watching the two sides come together, because I'm like, okay, neither of you should be doing what you're doing. Like, there's a middle ground here, and neither of you are seeing it.
Yeah.
I think another thing that was really interesting about this tournament, though, is because of this playstyle that Europe has, and because of the playstyle that a lot of North American teams have, certain North American teams, specifically C9, I'm going to call them out because P1 is a little bit of an enigma coming in. Like, they were really bad at the start of the split, and then they had roster changes. So we didn't really know like how they were going to perform. People were just kind of writing them off and saying 0-6 because we didn't know how these new players would perform with the team on stage. We didn't, so, but with Cloud9 specifically, they were not an early game team in North America, to the point
Yeah.
where, like, they would get picks or fights, and this was, like, most apparent in the TSM series, which they actually won, but it was really frustrating to watch, because
Sure.
you'd be like, you can get a turret here, and they just don't.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I can't tell you. Like, they just don't see it or something. I don't know. But that was the thing that, watching TSM C9, it really frustrated me about Cloud9 specifically, is that, because a lot of people harp on their early game, and this is one of the reasons, is just recognizing when you can go for those turrets after fights.
Yeah, and I think it really is, and you can observe when drakes are free, basically, and when teams can make a choice to get drakes with tempo advantage. So that's usually my issue with Europe and dragon control, but there is definitely some. I also think it reflects poorly on their river vision, which we've already talked about. Like, when you, especially in the T2 games, I think this has been the biggest thing, is that when you're pushing out in a lane and you have a pushing advantage in a lane, it makes a lot of sense to collapse with your two winning lanes if you're winning mid and bot, for example, and get secure river and jungle vision. And this is something that I think in the first game, when you're talking about G2, where Trick, the first time he went top, he would get the advantage for expect, but then they wouldn't necessarily do anything with it. Whereas if you looked at what was happening on the bottom side, like, Mike Young wasn't ganking or anything, but he would go into the enemy jungle and there would be vision there, and he could do this for free because mid and bot were pushing on their own, right? And so to me, like, casters were super hard praising G2's early game, but I felt like you're getting the exact same map advantages on the bot for literally doing nothing. And yay, Expect has kills. It's Expect. He's not going to carry the game against both P1's mid and bot, so.
As we saw multiple times. So do you think Europe is going to... Because I've seen a lot of European players tweeting, specifically G2, but, like, you know, we didn't show up. I think we need to make some adjustments in our meta. Do you think that better dragon control is going to be one of those things that they recognize?
I think it could be, for sure. I think G2 already are actually understand the dragon. I think G2, the disappointing thing is that I felt like in spring, G2 were significantly further ahead of the other teams in Europe. And so when G2 were performing poorly and you could identify reasons they were performing poorly, everyone was like, oh no, the competition in Europe is just so much better. And I was like, no, it's really not. G2 just suck. So that's the really stressful thing for me, because I was saying that, and I think I even had a rant on League Weekly when someone asked me why I rated Immortals as like the highest rated Western team on the ESPN power rankings. It's just, for me, it's really disappointing to see. And I think the reason why I thought that Europe would do better at this tournament than they did is because I felt like C9's and TSM's trajectory to becoming stronger was actually just really short, so I wasn't sure how reliable it was. So I think that if I had thought about it more, I probably would have been a lot higher on NA. But the thing is that, yeah, for me, I feel pretty down on the way EU are, because I think that G2's problems are related to more Engage being played, because more Engage is being played everywhere, not just in NA, right? It's been being played in EU, and that's a big part of why G2 have struggled more, is because they have trouble balancing pressure across the entire map if people are in side lanes. And I think EU has overtunneled on pinching side lanes and not fortifying mid when they do that. So if multiple people are showing in a side lane and then there's mid, so these are things that they can figure out for sure, but I'm not sure that teams like G2 can adapt, because I feel like Perks will just get caught. Perks is map awareness, Expect's map awareness are really, really shoddy, and I think that these are problems that you can track for G2 throughout their existence in the LCS, and when there are more engage picks and less like escapes, Perks has struggled. And that's been true of both summer splits for him. So I think that that's a really bad sign for G2. Fnatic, can Fnatic adapt? That's another question, is do I think Fnatic can adapt? Because I think a lot of people will say no. And I think it has to do with the players and whether or not they're willing to invest. Because I feel like we talked about this a little bit, is Europe's like cute things. Yeah. Because they spend more time thinking about the game than playing the game. And I think you have to put the time into expanding your champion pool. And styles develop if you have specific champion pools. And you figure out how to be surprising with these certain picks, and I'm not sure. I think Fnatic can do it if they put the time in. But the question is whether or not this group of players will put the time in, and I don't have all the faith in them to do that.
Yeah. And then UOL. I mean, UOL, I was just going to say, like, UOL seem really intent on kind of, we talked about this yesterday, and I know how we've also talked about how their drafting is very specifically oriented around a few of their players' champion pools. Like, especially in my opinion, both Exile and Xerxes.
I think Xerxes' champion pool is to an extent really affected by Exile, and whether or not he can, because I feel like if you had more pushing picks from Exile, Xerxes would play a lot more aggressive jungles, because I think Xerxes is like one of those talented guys who can play a lot of different things. But his pool, he plays a lot of scaling stuff just because he knows he's not going to have a lot of opportunities early. It's kind of my feeling on Xerxes. I think that Exile is sort of smart, but he doesn't really. Again, it's a time thing. I think that Exile probably could figure out matchups, but he hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about them or investing time into learning matchups really well. He even said that when I interviewed him today, and that's a big gap in what he does. So maybe I have the most faith in UOL, but I don't have faith in them developing kind of the macro understanding that goes with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So for me, it's pretty dire for Europe, and I feel like it's sad because it goes back to H2K, which was really fueling some of the developments in early game macro that we saw in this team in this region starting in 2015. Was H2K fueling a lot of these early game macro understanding and development, what you do and how you use lane swaps, and I think H2K kind of just FF'd their innovation aspect and how they want to use the early game starting this year. So,
that's awkward.
So you look at it, it's like Misfits should be this new team, right? But I don't think Misfits understand macro. So it's a little sad for Europe. I'm much more positive about Europe, however, than I am about LPL, which you can watch in the other episode of Making the Rounds that came out today. So I think Europe is slightly more self-aware, so maybe they can figure it out. Alright, so that was fun. Anything else you want to talk about before we make finals predictions?
No.
Okay.
I'm good.
Team Solo Mid versus Unicorns of Love.
Oh man. The classic IEM matchup. Yeah. I just thought it was funny that everyone kept being like, oh, because I feel like a lot of people's approach to international events, and I'm not going to say that I am, I try to avoid doing this, but I think I'm as guilty sometimes of this as everyone else. But you look at how that team has historically performed at the last international event. So for example, this is one of the reasons why people thought Fnatic were going to be so bad headed into the 2015 MSI, was because there were a few reasons. One, because Fnatic and UOL had a really terrible finals that I actually would not recommend that you go back and watch, even for posterity or something. I don't know, maybe you just love the teams, but don't watch that final because it was actually bad. But Fnatic came, and I believe TSM won IEM because of the weird WE knocking off GE Tigers. I almost said G2 Tigers for some reason. And yeah, so TSM, like, people are like, man, TSM is going to be so good, and then they were really not. And Fnatic took SKT to 5 games to this really phenomenal new performance from Bengi. But anyway, my point is that, like, I feel like we tend to look at how these teams have performed historically, and Riot themselves have also started doing this, because obviously at this tournament we had the best teams from the previous split, and we look at the way they've designed the MSI and Worlds, and a lot of it is based on prior performance at Riot run international events. So I think that is one of the reasons why a lot of people came into this and they're like, oh, North America is just going to get stomped because, you know, TSM didn't even make it out of their group at Worlds, and Europe is a lot better as a region. Sure. Just not because of like anything they actually saw in Europe, but just because of prior performance. So, and I think I was also guilty of that somewhat. Maybe it's just because I'm harsher on North American teams because I see them every week and I talk to the players, and you know, they're all kind of frustrated that they're not better. So I know there's a lot of hungry players out there that really want to improve. But yeah, that being said, so all of that being said, I do think based on their performance throughout this tournament, I think that TSM have been the best performing team at this tournament. Sure. So even though I don't think it will be a sweep by any stretch of the imagination, I think given how Bjergsen is performing right now, it's going to be very difficult to beat TSM. So that's why I'm going with TSM, mainly because they've just been playing really well. I think to some extent they understand how their team should play the game, and so that's helped them a lot. This meta is really good for them if they can just drop pushing lanes. And yeah, I mean, I hope maybe we see something different. I hope UOL, for example, like ban Syndra, but who knows?
I think NA's weird tendency to blind mid will, because I'm not really sure why you're blinding LeBlanc against a team that plays Kassadin. Just throwing that out there. That they blind the LeBlanc, they blind the Syndra, which uniquely are countered by champions that Exile happens to play. So I feel like if you don't blind your mid lane, Unicorns lose a lot of power. So I think that because of that, I mean, how hard is that to figure out? Let's be real. You either are gonna ban the Kassadin and the Vlad and then blind pick LeBlanc and Syndra, or you're going to just counter pick mid. And I think that's probably gonna be what happens with that. That's gonna shut down a lot of Unicorns would love to be power to be competitive in the early and mid game. I still think that TSM have really weird setups after 15 in terms of lane assignments and how they want to play out the game like that, but they also don't really seem to understand what, like, you don't have to contest this particular dragon. You can actually just keep pushing the lane.
That's an NA thing.
And if you push the lane, like, you should probably get the vision in the jungle so you don't get picked off. Just, basic League of Legends things. But, so that's kind of my feeling on how that matchup will go. So I think because of that, it's just, generally speaking, yeah, UOL have a few picks that could let them turn the game really effectively, but I think that, like, it's worth just throwing a Twitch ban out there, or a Twitch and a Kassadin ban, because I think after that, unicorns won't have these, like, insane hyper carries that can turn the game for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that unicorns have a lot of options, and that's my biggest issue with them. So I think that it will go to Team Solo Mid in the long run, but I think it'll be silly.
Yes.
So probably I'll say 3-1 Team Solo Mid. Anything else?
Yeah. No.
Good.
That is it.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
NA gooder than EU. Excellent. Both of my regions suck. It's obviously me. Anyway, we will be back tomorrow with the final episode of this, probably going over the final, and make sure to check out the Making the Rounds episodes on the LCK, LMS, and LPL as well.
You get to hear the good rants during those.
Yeah, the really angry rants. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you again.